Ephesians chapter 4, beginning at verse 20 to 32.
Ephesians 4, verse 20 to 32. You, however, did not come to know Christ that way. Surely you heard of him and were taught in him in accordance with the truth that is in Jesus. You were taught with regard to your former way of life to put off your old self, which is being corrupted by its deceitful desires, to be made new in the attitude of your minds, and to be put on the new self, created to be like God in true righteousness and holiness. Therefore, each of you must put off falsehood and speak truthfully to your neighbor, for we are all members of one body. In your anger, do not sin. Do not let the sun go down while you are still angry, and do not give the devil a foothold. Those who have been stealing must steal no longer, but must work, doing something useful with their own hands, that they may have something to share with those in need. Do not let any unwholesome talk come out of your mouths, but only what is helpful for building others up according to their needs, that it may benefit those who listen. And do not grieve the Holy Spirit of God, with whom you were sealed for the day of redemption. Get rid of all bitterness, rage, and anger, brawling and slander, along with every form of malice. Be kind and compassionate to one another, forgiving each other, just as Christ God forgave you. This is the word of the Lord.
Great. Well, it is really good to be with you again. I think last time I was here was baptizing Caleb. I think it was a couple of years ago. He was a little bit smaller in those days. Fell asleep all the way through the entire service, but I think it still works. But it's great to be with you today and to think about this topic that John was introducing us to a moment ago. And the subtitle of that little book that he flashed up there is Other Countercultural Notions. Because this idea about, the title of the book, by being yourself is a bad idea, is quite a countercultural notion, because this being yourself thing is so endemic in our culture. It's interesting, isn't it? When you go to a job interview, maybe you're going out for a date for the first time with someone that you just met, or maybe you're just meeting someone that you want to impress in some way. And you maybe go to a friend and say, what's your advice? I'm a little bit nervous about meeting this person. What should I do? And my guess is 9 times out of 10, you will get the advice, it's all right, just be yourself. And it's kind of become one of the great, almost the number one commandment in modern life, is just to be yourself, be who you are. And it's something we hear, it's in every Disney film, follow your heart, you know what it's like. Whether it's books that you look at in Waterstones or wherever you buy books, or online or on Kindle or whatever else it is, when you open magazines and newspapers, it's there all the time, be yourself. And I've been thinking about this for some time, and I read a little passage in the New Testament a little while ago, one that spoke about Jesus and what he said about yourself. And when he was speaking to his disciples quite early on in his ministry, he said this to them. He said, if you want to be my disciple, you have to learn to deny yourself, pick up your cross and follow me. And it struck me what a strange difference there is between what we say in our culture, which is to be yourself, and what Jesus says about deny yourself. And I thought, well, how do you make sense of these things? What is he on about? When he says deny yourself, is he talking about some sort of self-hatred, some kind of erasure of the self? Or actually is something else going on here? So I want to try and explore these ideas. Now, this idea about ourselves, and the way in which we talk about ourselves these days, what if you recognize that picture? That we spend a lot of time worrying about ourselves. We worry about what other people think of us, about the choices that we've made. We worry about how many followers we have on social media. We worry how many times our posts get retweeted or liked or whatever else it might be, because they're a kind of measure of how we're doing in this competition of the self in modern life. We always worry that others seem to live much more interesting and successful lives than we do. And we think, well, what is it about them that they have a better life than I do? What's wrong with me? We worry about ourselves quite a lot. And if I'm honest, when I'm given that advice, and in the past when I've been given that advice, just be yourself, I've often found it quite confusing advice and not always as helpful as it might seem. I remember as a teenager, it's a long time ago for me, but I remember as a teenager going out for a date with this girl that I'd sort of liked for quite some time. And again, someone said to me, "Oh, it's all right, just be yourself." And I can remember thinking, that's the last thing I want to be on this date, because if she knows what's going on inside my mind and my heart, all those little doubts and anxieties and lusts and everything else that's the last thing. Will be the only date that there will ever be. I really don't want to be myself at all. In fact, what I did and what we all do is to present a very sanitized view of ourselves that other people will somehow like. And let's be honest, we do a lot of that on social media. Certain parts of ourselves we don't put out there, certain bits we do put out there. Again, the person who always says the first thing that comes to mind in any social situation is often the person who actually gets into trouble quite quickly. And in fact, actually, when you think about it, when you're going into a new social situation, whether a group of people or to meet someone, actually thinking about yourself is probably the last thing you should be doing. Because you know what it's like when you meet someone who's just constantly thinking about themselves all the time? They're not usually a great deal of fun to be around. The most attractive people you meet, the warmest and most delightful people you meet, are the people who aren't thinking about themselves at all. They're thinking about you. They're much more interested in you than they are in themselves. They're not worried, am I being myself? They're just thinking about you. And so this bit of advice we give each other in modern life, be yourself, is a little bit more complicated than it sometimes seems. Now, there is a story behind this. Why do we tell each other to be ourselves? And there's a kind of cultural history that leads up to this as well. And there's a bit of a long story on it, but to try and short circuit this. Several hundred years ago, in what we might call the kind of pre-modern world, people had a sense that they fitted into a larger cosmic order, that there was a sort of structure of things, what's sometimes been called a sacred structure outside themselves, that they fitted into. And that sacred order was just there. We didn't construct it, we didn't make it, it was just there. That's the way the world was. And that's that gave people a sense of identity, who they were, how they fitted into the world, how they were to act, and so on. And so when they asked the question, who am I? Or how should I live my life? What are the rules that govern the life that I live? They tended to look outside themselves. And there are some religions that looked outside themselves to the kind of moral law, a sort of legal, well, not legal structure, but a kind of a structure of things that told you the way the world was. And religions like Confucianism and Taoism and Buddhism had that sense of a kind of moral law out there. There were other religions that said, no, not so much the moral law, but you look to God. And Islam, Judaism, Christianity are religions like that. But all of them looked outside to find moral truth, to find a sense of identity, to find out who we are in the world. Now, of course, over the last few hundred years, gradually, certainly here in the West, we've sort of lost that sense of there being a God outside or a moral structure in the world that tells us who we are. And so what do? We don't look outside to find out who we are. We don't look outside to find the moral law and truth. What do? We look inside. We look inside ourselves to find a sense of who we are. We look inside to find the instructions to tell us how to live our lives. That's the kind of way things work. We look not so much to the heavens, but into our hearts to find out the truth about life and the truth about ourselves. And at the same time, something else happened. And again, if you want to look into if you're interested, it's all to do with the beginnings of the Romanticism in the 18th and 19th century and so on. But basically what emerged out of that movement was a sense that each one of us has our own unique individual way of being human. That in the past we maybe emphasized more the fact that we share a kind of a common human nature. And every single one of us has this thing called human nature. That's what we share. That was the way we saw ourselves and each other. But from the 18th century onwards, we began to think of ourselves in different ways. That now each one of us has our own individual way of being human. And what matters is not so much what we share in common with each other, but what makes me different from you. My own individuality, my own particular personality, individuality, and so on. And stage of that, if you go into sort of psychoanalysis and Sigmund Freud and everybody else, it's actually our sort of fundamental desires, our longings that tells us ultimately who we are. So you can see the shift that's happened from a world where we looked outside ourselves to find truth and meaning and moral purpose and identity towards a world where we look inside ourselves to find those things. But I guess there may be a little bit of a problem with this. And those of you who know me will know that I'm unable to preach a sermon without mentioning my very favorite theologian, which is Martin Luther. And there was one stage where he said something very insightful. He said about, he was trying to describe what Christians describe of the word sin. In other words, what we do that's wrong. What's at the heart of that? And he defined sin like this. He said, it's the heart curved in upon itself. And his idea was that where we go wrong in life is when we curve in upon ourselves. We become obsessed with ourselves. And we're not opened out towards God and towards each other, but instead we curve in upon ourselves. And that's the heart of what goes wrong in human life, the heart curved in upon itself. St. Augustine, many, many years before that, used to write about how, again, similar way, rather than being opened out towards God, who's a bit like the sun, that, imagine a plant that grows up towards the sun and flowers as it's bathed in the sun. No, it's like a plant that kind of turns in upon itself and turns down towards the earth. And to turn inwards is to turn away from the light and the life that we're given. Barney and Dora received life not from themselves, but from their parents. They grow up receiving so much from other people and from God, and that's what we do as well. And so there's a suggestion that maybe this turn inwards, although it can seem so attractive and self-evident to us, may be at the heart of so much of what is wrong in modern life. Now let's go on to think about how Christians think about ourselves. Maybe at the heart of this modern view of the self is the idea that somehow inside each of us is some inner core of who we are. And that the kind of main aim of life is to kind of look inside ourselves to discover our true identity, which we find inside. That's what we're meant to do. That's the idea of being yourself, be true to yourself, be authenticity, and so on. It's a bit like we are artichokes. Imagine you're preparing an artichoke for a meal. What you do is you peel away all the kind of those sort of rather grotty leaves on the outside to find this delicious, beautiful, tasty center. And that's the idea we have of ourselves these days, that there is inside us some true inner individual self that makes us different from everybody else. But what if we are more like onions than artichokes? Because, of course, with an onion, when you try to prepare an onion, you take away the sort of shell at the outside, and you keep on digging into it. You go through the layers. And what do you find in the middle? Well, nothing. The layers are the onion. They are the very thing themselves. So, if you like, on the artichoke view of the world and ourselves, the idea is if you could strip away all the expectations that other people put upon you, all the roles that we play in life, all the things that everybody else, all the kind of frustrating bits that we fit into in society, if we could take away all those things, we could find our own inner individuality. But what if those very roles that we play in life, the relationships that we make, the commitments that we make over time, what if they are ourselves? What if they are the things that make us who we are? Because, of course, a much older view, and it's not just a Christian view of the self, is to suggest that we ourselves are not so much discovered, but created. They are created and formed over time. Yes, we are born into the world with our unique selves. Maybe we would call it DNA. Sometimes in the past they might have called it the soul. But a bit like putty, over time those selves are shaped and formed into the people that we are today. And they're formed by the relationships we're born into, by our parents and our families, by the relationships we build as we grow up, by the roles we play, the jobs we take on, the commitments we make, the decisions that form us. That's what makes us who we are. It's a bit like our bodies. Our bodies get shaped over time by the habits that we take on, by what we eat or don't eat, by the exercise that we take or don't exercise. Even our faces. There's a statement, I think it came from Albert Camus, that everybody over the age of 40 is responsible for their own face. Quite a thought, isn't it? Because our faces are shaped by to a certain extent by what happens to them, by how much we smile or frown or whatever else it might be. So just like our bodies are shaped over time by what happens to us, the decisions we make or don't make, the same way our inner selves are shaped by these things too. In the reading we had just a few moments ago from Ephesians 4, it actually talked about how, as a Christian, you have two selves working inside you. It talks about how you were taught with regard to your former way of life to put off your old self, which is being corrupted by its deceitful desires, to be made new in the attitude of your mind and put on the new self, created to be like God in true righteousness and holiness. And so it's saying, if you like, there are two selves inside us, and actually what we've done today with Dora and Barney, if you like, and the New Testament talks about baptism as being like a new self being born in you. You're their new Christian self. That's why we give them a new name in baptism, Dora, Barney, a name that marks them off, that is a little bit different from their families. Yes, they're individuals, but this new self has to be shaped and formed over time. Now that idea about two selves at work in us, again, maybe is true to our experience as well. Because when we ask the question, when you're told, be yourself, well, you might think, well, which self am I meant to be? Which desires am I meant to follow? So, there are bits inside me that I quite like, and I don't mind coming out. There are bits inside me that I don't like, and I don't want to come out. When I feel like lashing out in anger at someone, should I follow my heart at that moment? If you fall in love with someone that you're not married to and is maybe married to someone else, should you follow your heart in that case? End up destroying two families or one family? Or do you resist the voice that's telling you to do that? This idea that somehow we should simply follow our heart is not as simple as it might seem. And again, when we say be yourself, which role, which takes precedence? Because, of course, we all have multiple selves all the time. There's the job that you do. You may be a parent. You may be a friend. You may be a brother or a sister. You may be someone in a particular community. Which self takes priority? There's all kinds of decisions that need to take place here. And so when Jesus says we need to learn to deny ourselves, what does he mean? Well, I think he means this, that when you recognize those two voices, those two selves within yourself, he's saying not that you need to hate yourself. That's not what he's talking about at all. He says to recognize that little voice inside you, that little voice that always wants to be number one, that always wants to be liked, that always wants to be better than everybody else. That voice that is always whining because it feels it gets badly treated, that always wants other people to think we're wonderful, that little voice that always is there in our heads, and to be quite ruthless with it. To deny that self, but instead to feed the other self. This self that is less self-obsessed, but is more focused upon loving God and our neighbors. Which self do you encourage? Which self do you feed? Now, we kind of recognize this in children, don't we? When a child has a tantrum because they don't get their own way, as a parent, you learn to discipline the child. Thing is that as we grow up, we still have those tantrums, we just get a little bit better at hiding it. Because we still want to get our own way, but we get a little bit more sophisticated in the way we manage it. But that self is still there. And when Jesus says deny yourself, he's saying we've got to be quite ruthless on that self and allow the new self in Christ to emerge. And following the call of Jesus means learning to know the difference of those voices, the old self and the new self in your heart. When Jesus was asked, what is the most important commandment of all? What's the most important thing you need to know about being human? He said, not be yourself, as maybe we would. He said, learn to love God and love your neighbor. He was recommending and pointing us to a way of life which is not obsessed with ourselves, that perpetual anxiety about who we are, how we come over, whether people like us or not. But instead a life which is so fascinated with God and with other people that actually learns to be truly happy. And in a way, that's what we're doing here today. We're coming for this moment, this hour of time in the week, where we turn our attention away from ourselves towards the God who reveals himself to us in Jesus Christ. That's what we do when we worship, when we sing songs, when we listen to the Bible, when we even come to baptism here. We're taken out of ourselves to look into the face of God in Jesus Christ. And we're brought into this place where we're gathering with other people and we're learning to love our neighbors here in church and in the places that we live as well. Learning to lose that self-obsession. Not worrying too much about being ourselves, but learning to love God and to love our neighbors. And when we do that, what we find is that that new self does emerge. And that little thing, be yourself, well, maybe it has a little bit of element of truth to it. But the question is, which self are you going to be? The old self that St. Paul talks about, the old self being corrupted by its deceitful desires, or the new self created to be like God in true righteousness and holiness? And what happens when we come to the place where we gaze into the face of God in Jesus Christ? What we see there is love. Love that draws us out and makes us fascinated by that very love. Draws us out towards other people. There's something about worship that makes us lose our obsession with ourselves. We slowly realize that we are, as we have been reminded about Dora and Barney today, that they are children of God. That's who they are. Loved by God in Jesus Christ. We long for them to know that all the way through their lives. But that's true of us as well, if we choose it to be. We slowly realize that we are beloved children of God, who loves us and who longs to shape us into the image of Christ. And we learn to begin to love our neighbor. We begin to gain a fascination, both with God and with other people. And so maybe this is the wisdom of the Christian faith, where we learn to be our true Christian selves, the new self created to be like God in righteousness and holiness. We lose that crippling self-obsession that so many of us struggle with from week to week, month to month, year to year. We find ourselves reshaped in the image of Christ. We become holy and we become truly happy. Amen.